Pleasure working with Ken. We've had a number of conversations over the last 2 years, and you really learn a lot from working with someone with Ken's experience, and it's been great working with the community to, again, fill in those holes, develop the understanding, and to be able to engage a whole bunch of Colby students in this work. So I'll begin by thanking the National Science Foundation, the BRCA, the MLRC, and Tom Klingenstein, who's funded a lot of the work over the last 2 years. So how do you go bankrupt? 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. So that's Ernest Hemingway. That's our challenge, right? It's the gradually part. That's what we're in now. And what we want to do is we want to avoid the suddenly part. And that's the conversation that this group has to have. How certain do we need to be before we take action? And hopefully you never get to the suddenly part. So let's look at the suddenly part just to put it in perspective. This is a plot of the Secchi transparency on East Pond, starting in 1975, moving to today. So the Secchi transparency is a disc. You lower down into the lake until you can't see it anymore. And the deeper it is, the better it is. And if you look back, we look back in the 70s, the transparency was pretty good. And then something happened right there, 1988. It went from pretty good to pretty green. Okay? And so Hemingway was right on East Pond, and that's the challenge. We don't want to have an East Pond scenario. And East Pond there's things we can do. They're probably going to do an alum treatment on East Pond. That would be good news, but you don't want to get there. As Ken mentioned, anoxia is bad. Anoxia is driving this problem. It's bad for really 3 reasons. It kills the fish, it promotes the internal nutrient loads, and mixing promotes those algae blooms. The mixing of the deep anoxic water to the surface is what drives the bloom. This is East Pond on a bad year. You can see the green from an airplane or from space. So this is a Google Earth image, and the folks on East Pond were pretty glad when this image rolled off and there's a new image of East Pond taken at a different time of year. You can zoom in and see the algae moving across, and this is a Secchi depth of about 2 meters. So the worst case scenario on Great Pond, the Secchi transparency gets to 4 meters, you get to 2 meters, and it has real consequences. You don't want to swim in a lake with 2 meter Secchi. So, as Ken mentioned, the anoxic extent has expanded. We can thank all of the people that have worked in these lakes for the last 40 years, because without that data, we wouldn't have had that historical benchmark. So the anoxic extent has expanded, and our job right now is to understand how that extent is progressing in the sort of contemporary time period. The other thing we need to recognize is that not all Great Pond is deep. So take 2 lines. Start on the north, work your way south on each side of Boyce Island. And when you do that, these are the cross sections of the lake. So that's you were trolling along, that's the depth underneath your boat. And so we have the north end right here, heading south along this transect, and then the north end heading south along this transect. And it's the deep water in the lake that we care about. So it's this water below 10 meters where the anoxia is occurring. But notice there's this whole area that's right around 10 meters. It's the yellow in this diagram. If the thermocline sets up a little higher and the anoxia moves from 10 meters to 9 meters, you can see how much of the lake is now going to go anoxic. And if the anoxia creates the nutrient blooms, releases the nutrients, that's the problem. So the good news is we're doing a pretty good job of monitoring it. We have a buoy sitting right there, it's right there, and we are now monitoring the oxygen, temperature, condition of the lake continuously. So this is the buoy. If you go out by Hoyt's, that's Goldie, it's floating out in the middle of the lake. If you go out at night, hopefully it's flashing at you. Please do not hit my buoy with your boat. And this is what the buoy tells us. The buoy is giving us real-time data on the oxygen concentration. So we'll start along the bottom. This is last year's data. So this is the spring, this is the fall, and this is just another way of showing you the data that Ken showed in his presentation. In the spring, the oxygen in the surface slowly declines to about 8 parts per million and then stays constant. But in the deep water, the oxygen concentration just keeps going down and down and down, and we're losing 1% of our oxygen a day. So you lose 1% per day, it takes 100 days for the oxygen to go away. That's about right. So we lose all the oxygen by the end of August. The problem is if it takes 80 days for the oxygen to go away, then we have a problem. So low oxygen releases phosphorus from the sediments, and then the oxygen returns to the deep water in the fall. Let me go back one more. And that's what's happening here. The sensor didn't move, it's just that the lake mixed vertically, and that oxygen came down from the surface and was carried down. So this, the green line is a sensor at about 30 feet below the surface, and the blue line is a sensor that's about 55 to 60 feet below the surface. So as the water column mixes vertically, we get oxygen down, and that happens in the fall. So ice out dates matter because ice out determines when this process starts. Ice in dates matter because that determines when this process ends. And climate change is happening. We're changing the dates of ice out and ice in. Ice out in Maine is now 2 weeks later, 2 weeks earlier than it used to be. And so we have an increasing, we have the phosphorus that we put into the lake historically, but on top of that, we have climatic influences that are changing this profile. This is just another way to look at the data. It's actually hard to look at all those profiles and see what's going on, so I've made you a map. The map on the vertical axis is depth, so this is the surface up here, and this is the deep water down here, and this is day since January 1st. So this is April to October, and this is temperature. And what you're seeing is the beginning of the year, the lake is cold, it's blue, and it's uniform, mixed, top to bottom. And then as the spring warms up, the surface water warms up, the bottom water warms up a little, but not as much. And this is the thermocline right here, and this is the warm water that we all like to swim in. That warm water creates a boundary between the, oops, I should know how to run my own advancer here. This is the boundary between the warm water and the cold water. That's called the thermocline, and it creates a physical boundary for mixing. And the consequence of that is that our oxygen, which starts high, decreases with time. So this is the oxygen in Great Pond last summer. So starting about now, right about August 1st, the bottom of the lake goes anoxic. It stays anoxic till the end of October, and then anoxia spreads upward, and we'll call that the dead zone. So that's what we're worried about. We're worried about the extent, the timing of the dead zone, how long does it last, and how big does it get. So one of the ways to sort of keep track of that dead zone is that you can actually add up all the area of the lake that's anoxic, and you multiply it by the number of days it's anoxic, and that gives you a metric which is called the anoxic factor. So the anoxic factor, how much sediment is exposed to low oxygen? Back in the 1980s, it was about 0.2, and now it's around 7 or 8. So we've got about a 30-fold increase in the anoxic factor, so about 30 times more sediment is exposed to low oxygen water than it was historically. That's why we all got involved in this conversation. We started to look at 40 years ahead, and we said, wait a minute, something's changed in these lakes, and we better pay attention to it. Anoxic extent is expended 30 times. That's why we're here, and now the question is, what strategies do we want to consider, and will this cause a bloom in the foreseeable future? So is phosphorus being released in the deep water? The answer for 2015 is yes. This is a plot of the phosphorus coming out of the sediments, and right here in the end of the summer, the phosphorus is coming out of the sediments and going into the deep water. Iron is also coming out of the sediments and going into the deep water, and that's consistent with the iron binding up the phosphorus under oxygenated conditions and releasing the phosphorus under anoxic conditions. Good news is that this phosphorus, A, there's not too much of it, and B, it's still reasonably deep in the lake, and if it doesn't come to the surface, it can't cause a bloom. So what do you need if you're a plankton? You need phosphorus, you need sunlight. You get sunlight at the surface, phosphorus is coming up from depth. It's when those two reach each other that you end up having trouble. So does the deep nutrient-rich water get to the surface? And the answer is yes, but only for a couple weeks at the end of the summer. So this is a plot that we will make every year. The blue line is the depth of the anoxic water. The red line is the depth of the thermocline. All right, so the thermocline sets the depth essentially the light's going to penetrate into the lake. The red line is the depth that the nutrient-rich water is going to move vertically up into the lake. And when those two cross, as they do, right around the end of August, that's when you get an uptick. The green dots are the second transparencies. And you notice we get an uptick in the second transparency at the point where those two cross. So last year, we had a bloom. Moderate bloom. It happened in October. Pete Callan and I were probably the only ones to see it. Nobody else cared. You were all home, right? It was a diatom bloom at the end of the summer, but it was happening in October. If that happens in August, that's where we start to have a problem. So what about 2016? I showed you this plot of 2015 so you can now calibrate on 2016. So this data is 3 days old. Right, so we've been collecting samples, and where's Brenda? Brenda's here somewhere. I don't know where she is. So Brenda's been leading a whole crew of students out in the lakes, working with volunteers. Anyone that's been taking our students out in the lakes, thank you so much. That really helps us out. And so they've been out sampling probably 10 or 15 times this year, and we now have two plots. The 2016 is on the top, and the 2015 is on the bottom. So this is temperature. Red is hot, blue is cold, and look at these 2 years. We started with a really warm year, and then in June it got cold. So this was looking bad. We had this early stratification, looked like we were going to have a really long, hot summer, and then we got that rain and wind event in June, and this cooled down the surface of the lake, and then it sort of re-stratified again. And this is 2015, so you can see we're maybe a couple days ahead, but not 2 weeks. Which we would have been if we hadn't had the better weather in June. This gets back to Ken's comment. When's it going to bloom? Well, tell us when the weather's going to be next year and the next year and the next year. We know that we're going to have warm, hot summers. We know that we're going to have cooler summers. The variability is going to determine the extent of the bloom. Let's look at oxygen. This is the oxygen data for Great Pond in 2015. Okay, there's the dead zone. This is the oxygen right now in Great Pond. It's actually looking okay, about the same as 2015, and it'll determine what happens in the end of the summer is how this sets up over the next couple of weeks. So where's Lynn Matson? It would be very convenient if this meeting was at the end of August, not at the end of July, because then we could actually show you all the data, but yeah, it is what it is. Okay. So back to Hemingway, a couple of points to leave you with, and then I know that we'll be both happy to answer questions. How does the community define a clean lake? So that's an answer everyone needs to you need to answer that question before you can develop any remediation strategy. I've heard a couple of answers. I want the water to be like it was in 1983. I want cold water fish back in Great Pond. Okay, those are things that you can now engineer toward. Has the water quality declined? Yes. Will Great Pond bloom? Probably, but not next year. Well, it's possible it'll bloom next year, but the trajectory is downward, and over the next 10 years, it's reasonably good I would say more than a 50% probability that we're going to have a bad bloom year. The Belgrades, in many ways, are a microcosm of the greater climate change debate. We actually start to understand how all these processes work. We know that the ice out is happening earlier and earlier. We know that the lake is mixing later in the fall. So we know all of these things, and now we're going to have to ask the question, are we going to buy a solution? Possibly. That's something for the community to decide. And what role should the community play in that action? So the community's not going to go out and add aluminum, but they're certainly going to help pay for it. But the community can control what they're doing with their camp roads, what they're doing with their house lots, and in the process of taking that sort of preventative action, that watershed action, everyone buys into the solution, and that helps you to preserve any remediation that you then make. So it's really a collaborative effort, and the community is not this group. You You all drank the Kool-Aid. You're here on a Sunday night at a nice evening in the Belgrades. It's the people that aren't here that are also part of the community, and that's going to be the tougher conversation to have, is how do you engage everyone in this community about a solution that hopefully happens before the lake really turns green. So with that, I'll stop.